Hi, and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. By hosting these webinars online, we're hoping we're going to be able to accommodate folks from all over the state that are interested in gleaning in their communities. If you have any questions, comments, or would like me to clarify anything that I discussed during today's webinar, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or you can send them to me directly. Should you like to reach out to me directly, you can find my contact information at the end of this video. With all that said, let's begin. Today's session is the third in a 6-part webinar series we're calling our Master Gleaner Training. We've put this together as a means of training people throughout the state on how GleanKY's model works, with the hopes of making it more readily available to those interested in seeing gleaning happen in their communities. We're hoping to have both longtime volunteer leaders as well as people completely new to gleaning in this course, as a way for us all to be on the same page and to learn from each other. This webinar takes a look at an important part of what we do. It's an overview of the principles and guidelines important to making sure all of our stakeholders stay safe in their interactions with GleanKY. If you're still pretty new to GleanKY and haven't seen the first 2 webinars yet, I would definitely recommend going back to see them before viewing this webinar. They should provide a good foundation on how GleanKY was founded, as well as an in-depth look at how to get started gleaning with your local farmers market. Both of those first 2 webinars should be linked in the description of this video and can be viewed at any time through our YouTube channel. So, like in our first 2 webinars, I think it's useful to view safety through the lens of our 3-part model. There are considerations to make when thinking about safety at every point along a gleaning trip, for the source of the produce, the group receiving the produce, as well as the gleaners who serve as the connection between source and recipient. When speaking about safety, I think it's also important to think about the idea of stewardship. Teaching our gleaners to be good stewards of our work goes a long way in taking care of our partners. Not only is it important to consider these practices for the sake of everyone's safety, but making efforts to ensure this sort of protection makes everyone involved in our work feel well taken care of, which only strengthens the vital relationships we build with our partners. In general, I also think it seems more effective to talk about this kind of stuff in terms of principle, rather than discussing specific policies. Teaching our gleaners basic principles about health and safety practices helps them to make the right decisions when presented with unusual situations that we may not be able to anticipate. Our produce sources might be the part of our work that people think about the least when thinking about safety. They may think about how to keep volunteers safe while they're on a farm or at a grocery store to glean, but often don't think about the measures we take to ensure the sources themselves are respected and taken care of when we glean from them. Not only is this the right thing to do, it shows the farmer or grocery manager that we're serious and make careful consideration about our work. Leaving this sort of impression on our sources from the first time gleaners step foot on their property ensures that we're invited back to glean with them again and again. When thinking about health, safety, and well-being when concerning sources of produce, there are 2 major things to consider. The first is about conducting ourselves in ways that respect sources' everyday operations, taking good care of their property, their land, and any other food that may be around the produce that we're gleaning. The second has more to do with behaving in ways that ensure a source is able to adhere to any health and safety guidelines that they may be beholden to. For farms and orchards, this could mean acting in compliance to organic regulations, or for groceries it might mean working in ways that respects their ability to pass their health inspection. Though each farm and each grocery is managed and runs differently from one another, there are a handful of common things to address when thinking about being respectful of their operations. The most obvious principle is to make sure our gleaners take good care of our source's property. At farms, gleaners may be lent equipment for harvesting or packaging produce, things like harvest knives, wagons, crates, and more. It's important to use these items with a good understanding of how to use them in order to avoid damaging them, and to return them to the farm in an equal or greater condition than when they were loaned to our gleaners. At groceries, it's common that produce will be packed on carts that belong to the store. Gleaners should be careful to use these carts in ways that don't damage them, any doors, or any other objects in the path to their vehicles. These carts and any reusable containers belonging to the grocery should be returned neatly to the grocery after a gleaner has packed the produce into their vehicle. Generally, it's important that our gleaners are good stewards of all property at our produce sources. Having good awareness of their surroundings helps prevent damage from occurring to expensive equipment or even to other food surrounding the produce that they're gleaning. At farms and groceries, one of the most common types of questions we get have to do with where our gleaners should drive and park their vehicles. At farms, it's important to discuss with the landowner where you and your volunteers may and may not drive. You'll want to look out for things like irrigation pieces or other equipment that may be very expensive for a farmer to replace. You'll also want to know where you and your volunteers can park your vehicles. It's important not to block access for a farmer and their equipment so that they're able to continue to work around you and your gleaners. Beyond that, many farms, and orchards especially, rely on agrotourism for a large portion of their income. Having your volunteers park in specific areas leaves their usual spots open for customers and ensures that our presence on their property doesn't have a negative impact on their ability to do business. At groceries, gleaning typically happens in the same place where a store receives their deliveries, and often happens during a similar window of time. Always discuss with grocery managers where the best place is for gleaners to park their vehicles when loading them with produce, and make sure your volunteers are aware of the other work happening around them. When gleaners work to stay out of the way of this receiving work, it ensures that they won't disrupt a grocery's operations. Another very important thing to consider when visiting a farm is how a gleaner's behavior can affect the farm's ability to adhere to any guidelines and regulations that they're beholden to. Farms are generally required to meet certain certifications in order to sell their food, and many of these growers are also working to meet even stricter regulations to receive an organic certification. Our gleaners' good behavior on their property helps make sure they can meet these requirements. Though many farmers will explain specific behaviors that help meet these requirements, there are a handful of common things to always keep in mind. Have your volunteers wash their hands immediately prior to gleaning and handling a farmer's produce or equipment. Always have volunteers use the restroom in an actual restroom, never outdoors and never near a field of produce. Don't allow volunteers to smoke on a farmer's property. And if a volunteer is sick, have them stay home and encourage them to glean with us again at a later date after they've returned to full health. Generally, our gleaners have much less access to sensitive areas when gleaning from a grocery, but the same basic principles of sanitation apply to groceries as apply to farms. Our gleaners are an irreplaceable part of what we do. Without them, there simply would be no way for us to get out and glean and deliver produce. Because of this, it's extremely important that our volunteers are well trained to glean in ways that keep them safe and healthy. Beyond it being the right thing to do, taking steps to ensure our gleaners' safety also makes them more comfortable gleaning and can make them feel taken care of. This sense of care and safety can be the difference in a volunteer gleaning only once or becoming a long-time dependable gleaner. Gleaning is often a labor-intensive activity that can present dangers to volunteers who are underprepared. It's important to communicate basic strategies to volunteers ahead of their gleaning that helps them prevent injury or danger. One of the biggest things gleaners can do to be prepared is making sure they wear shoes and clothing that are durable and appropriate for this kind of work. We recommend closed-toed shoes with good grip, as well as clothes that ensure a gleaner stays cool outdoors. Or, in the case of the group you can see in the photo here, this group was smart to dress in layers for a December orchard glean in 30-degree weather. Gleaners should bring an ample supply of water with them when gleaning, particularly when making a gleaning trip to a farm or orchard. Staying hydrated when spending multiple hours outdoors helps volunteers prevent overheating and other heat-related dangers. Volunteers should do their best to ensure that they don't work alone. When they have someone to help them glean, volunteers will have someone close by in case they're in need of help, and they're less likely to overexert themselves when lifting heavy containers of produce. Another important way of preventing danger and injury to volunteers is to ensure they're trained well. At farms and orchards, volunteers should receive training from a volunteer leader or from a farmer themselves on how to correctly and safely use any harvest tools and equipment that they'll be using to harvest or collect produce. At groceries, gleaners should have a clear understanding of the full process of picking up the produce from the store and delivering it to a recipient. If possible, it's great for a volunteer leader to accompany a gleaner for their very first grocery glean. Beyond good training, it's vital that a volunteer knows and respects their physical limitations and do not attempt to do things that are beyond their abilities. Even when knowing any and all safety guidelines, it's always possible that someone can get injured while gleaning. Due to the nature of gleaning, it's possible for gleaners to experience cuts and scrapes, heat-related illness, injuries due to overexertion, and more. As a volunteer leader, we encourage you to bring a first aid kit when leading group gleanings and to be familiar with using its contents. Beyond this, we also recommend having first aid training in order to make you feel more comfortable and effective when responding to an injury or an illness. Should you be interested in learning more about this, don't hesitate to contact us. It's important for gleaners to consider safety and good stewardship all the way to when they deliver produce to an end recipient agency. Not only does this keep donated produce safe to eat, it puts people at ease and ensures that they have a better experience with gleaned produce. One of the biggest impacts a gleaner can have on the safety and quality of gleaned produce is in handling it properly from the moment they pick it up to the point of handing it off to our recipients. Volunteers should be gentle when touching and moving produce and should always wash their hands prior to doing so. They should also take care to avoid crushing, scraping, or otherwise damaging produce when packing it into containers, as well as when placing it into their vehicles. Containers and vehicles used to transport produce should be sanitary in order to avoid contamination of otherwise safe-to-eat produce. Volunteers should also do their best to deliver produce as quickly as possible to ensure it can be refrigerated by a recipient group soon. Not everything we glean is fit for human consumption, and when this is the case, it should never be passed along to someone to eat. Our rule of thumb is that if a volunteer wouldn't eat it themselves, they shouldn't give it to someone else. But gleaners should always take care to look for any produce that is moldy, rotten, or otherwise inedible, and remove it from the delivery. One final consideration for gleaners is their interaction when handing off the produce to a recipient agency. Gleaners should communicate any vital information they can think of about the produce. What the produce is, whether it should be refrigerated, whether it needs to be washed before eating, whether it should be cooked prior to consumption, and any other information relevant to using it safely. When gleaning from a farm, a great resource from learning this information is from the farmer donating it themselves. They'll be able to make good recommendations on how to use it best. Not only does this ensure that recipients are aware of any efforts they should take to ensure that produce is safe to eat, it allows them to pass that information along to any individuals receiving the produce, and then makes it more likely to utilize the produce well. Like I mentioned at the start, I would encourage you to talk to your gleaners about principles of safety and sanitation, rather than trying to have them memorize a bunch of specific policies. Teaching them to think critically and intentionally about what they're doing and why they're doing it a certain way will help make sure they're prepared when they encounter problems that we can't plan for. Though this was just a basic overview with guidelines, I always welcome you or your gleaners to reach out to me if there's any specific problems I can help work you through. Taking the time to consider something like safety when gleaning is vital to GleanKY's long-term success and shows our partners at every step of our work that we're serious and deliberate about what we do. That wraps up today's webinar, all about keeping our sources, recipients, and gleaners safe when gleaning produce. On the next webinar, to be posted on July 29, I'll be talking more about the how-tos of connecting with sources of produce, volunteer gleaners, and groups that need donations of produce in your community. Should you have any questions about the material I've covered today, don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask. I've left my contact information on the screen if there's anything you'd like to speak with me about more in depth. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for this webinar, and I look forward to having you in for our next one.